Anyway. Alright, we're in recording now. Let me start stuff. Music. Alright, welcome again to the Treehouse. It is a New Year's Eve special edition, I guess. There's already fireworks happening outside my window. Not sure if you can hear them. I hope not. Right. So, we took a break last Sunday because there was Crimbus happening. And I could not excuse myself from that. So, yes. It's been 2 weeks since the last episode. And last time we did some UI programming stuff. And, we worked on some text input stuff.
We can hear your birds playing with fireworks. Happy Kringle.
Thank you for the Kringle. So, right, we were working on some text input stuff, and there were two particular issues that I talked about towards the end of that I'm not sure how to solve. And this time I want to look at one of those, and see what we or I or whoever can figure out to maybe solve that problem. Also, I'm still slightly sick, so I'll be coughing every now and again, and I apologize for that in advance. Or, like, I guess, already after the fact. Anyway. Let me get things set up here so I can draw. Whoa. Yay, Treehouse. I guess.
You should set some festive dancing GIF animations in the corner.
I should do that. That's an excellent suggestion. Let me just finish drawing this stupid piece of shit here. I promise you it's not a drawing stream, but I just want Treehouse, yay. Let me get some GIFs on as well, because, let me see what I can find, Anyway, so, while I'm doing that, I guess I can explain what is going on today. We will be looking at things... Mostly, we'll be looking at the question of how to separate the logic of a UI component from how it is painted. Since usually that's something you're gonna want to distinguish. I can't really find anything good that's transparent. Here's some shitty GIFs. Hold on. There we go. Kablamo. Right. So, the reason why we want to look at this is because usually the way the UI component behaves is clearly defined, but how it is drawn depends on your application, because probably wanna design the UI elements to fit whatever game you're writing or whatever, and you don't want to have to rewrite the entire component yourself. So detaching that and allowing the users to only say how the elements are styled sounds like a very good idea. And finding good gifts is harder than I thought it would be. Hold on, I got something. Here we go. Oh shit, his hat got transparent. Well, whatever. There you go. Okay, we're now sufficiently festive, I hope. I would put on some Christmas songs, but that would get me banned on YouTube. So, no thanks to that. Anyway. So, finally on to business.
Thank you.
No problem. Whoa, cables. Right. So for example, if we have the simplest example, I guess, is like you have a rectangular button that says okay. And now the behavior that you have for that, let me actually make a new layer here. Oh. So we have a button, okay. And the behavior of the button is like it acts on, like it has an on click thingy, and then it does stuff. So it can be clicked and like it has mouse interaction, or like it can be accepted, or like on accept or something. And it has like on, I guess, hover or whatever, or on active. So that's the behavior that it has. And the behavior depends on your input. So either if you use a gamepad to select that button to make it active, and then press the confirm button to, you know, accept it, I guess. Or if you use the mouse to hover over it and then click on it. So that's behavior, right? And then you have the ways in which it is drawn, which is to say it's like a, I guess in this case it's rectangular, flat, text, centered. But for instance, you could also want, I guess I'll call this visibility. Nah, that's a bad idea. What should I call this? Looks. So that's one way you could draw it, but I guess you could also have like a round button that says okay. I don't know. Or you could have like a button as part of a different kinds of menu. For example, what you often have in games is you have like a fan menu. Is something like this, where you have different kinds of options, with different kinds of buttons in this case, and they're all sort of a pie, I guess, like A, B. Right? So, in both of those cases, not only is it differently drawn, right? But the behavior is also different, because now, at least for, like for the circular button, when you're using a mouse, it no longer is simply a rectangular region test whether the button is active or not. You need to do a circular test. In terms of the fan menu, if you're using the controller, then the question is, in which order do things become active? So there's a bunch of ways in which how things are drawn and how their behavior are intertwined. So we need to have a mechanism that sort of describes, I guess, the shape of the object, the bounding box, if you will, and a way to describe how it is actually drawn after that. So I guess you would, if you compare this to, you know, your general actual game stuff, you have a character, right? And then you have a polygonal mesh or whatever the fuck that describes how you draw it. But then you have like a hitbox or something that does the actual collision and interaction with the world. So I guess we need to have a similar kind of description for UI elements, where we have a way to describe how hit detection is handled and how things are drawn. Now, that handles the mouse case, but I'm not sure if there's other kinds of behavioral patterns and things that might be influenced by how the element looks. In this case of the fan menu, where I said like which element is selected next, I guess really depends on less each individual button and more so on the container, which would be the fan itself. So that behavior will be encoded elsewhere and not necessarily as part of that. That actually opens up another thing. No, does it? Not sure. So, right. My brain is farting. I don't know what's going on. Hold on a sec. Right. What other ways could the stylistics influence the behavior?
Fart.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
We really need audio emotes.
Well, you're free to implement that. I'm not gonna bother. Hello, baggers. Welcome to the Treehouse. How are you doing on New Year's Eve? Okay, so right. I'm constantly confused about whether what I've currently thought about is enough or not. It seems too simple somehow. Cooking a bit of a roast. Nice. It's good. Okay, so let me think about the ways in which one can even interact with the UI at all. So basically, Let's jar like window or something. Whoa, crazy. Okay. So we have a window, and then there we have some kind of shit. Say. Well, trying to think. So, for example, we could have some kind of login flow, or nah, that's a bad example. Let's say we have a loading menu or something. So we have a list of saves or whatever. And then we have like options here to like, I don't know, delete or like, I don't know, copy. And then we have an option to go back. Right. So what kinds of flows do we have? Well, if we're using a mouse and it's obvious, you just point and click. And the question becomes, how do we know when a button is being clicked on or not? So in more concrete terms, we will probably have a group of that contains the back button and everything else. So, right, and then we would have a group that has these buttons. Or let me use like a deeper red. You have a group for the actual list, and then for the buttons, and then we have each item in the menu. Each save state, I guess. So the way you would do this is basically each group has says sort of what its region is that it covers, and then based on that you can say, okay, the mouse cursor is now within my region, so I'll do handling of mouse events. So it delegates that to all of its subcomponents, and if any of those are,
you know what game had a good UI? Journey.
You mean in the sense that it didn't have any UI? I don't remember it having much of anything. So, you know, if you have a group and it knows that now the cursor is within it, then it's going to delegate these events to all the subcomponents until one of the subcomponents says, okay, it's within my jurisdiction, and now it does things according to that. So that's how, you know, input delegation for that works. In a similar manner, if you're using a gamepad and you're not pointing and clicking, you're basically always alternating between these groups. So for example, if we're at the topmost level, you can either go to the previous item or the next item, and that would always cycle between the back and the next group. So you could go back, or you could say, okay, I want to actually do something with this. And then when you confirm, the focus goes inwards, and then you can select between, you know, switch between these two. And then within those, you can switch between, you know, stuff. Until you get to one input component that can actually accept the confirm button press on its own. Otherwise, it always just, an accept basically goes a level deeper, and the reject goes a level outwards. So that way you can do that kind of delegation. Now, right. The problem, I guess, now becomes if you have, say we have a thing, a group of items that are circular somehow. I don't know, maybe you have like, I don't know, some fancy as buttons or whatever, like share, whatever, tweet, what, and hockey book. So in that case, because it's not rectangular, the region computation is more complicated. So if we stick both of those into a group, so right, we have a group here, and then now the group needs to determine whether any input events fall into its jurisdiction. You can't just do a rectangular test, right? Because, well, I guess it could if you like implicitly define like something like this, but I'm not sure if that might not lead to problems at some point. For example, if you have a more complicated case where things might overlap, in which case it's not clear which of them should receive the input events. So I don't know if that's good enough. In the worst case, the group would have to be able to do sort of a union test of all the subcomponents, I guess. But that probably is too complicated. So I guess, yeah, I don't know. I don't think that's a case worth dealing with, really. Especially because it's not about tests being expensive. We're talking about UI here. You can like spend a few milliseconds. It's more about the question of what is feasible to define. Like you wanna be able to, you know, write your UI quickly, relatively, without having to fiddle around with loads of bullshit. And if the system would have to include code to somehow compute a unified region for complex shapes, then that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff to write. Well, not for the user, but for me, for seemingly very little gain. So I don't think I want to handle the case where things might overlap rectangular. Maybe? I don't know. It's hard. Let me try to think of another example. So, for instance, well, I want to think of an example that might actually come up in reality. And what I'm trying to think of right now is, for example, if you have something like this, where one group is sort of like this L shape or whatever, where it has like things up here and it has things here, right? And it might be like one big group for both of those things, and then have subgroups that have like this horizontal bar and this vertical bar as subgroups, sort of. Right? So you might have that, but it is totally defined as one major group. And in that case, the major group covers everything, the whole screen, including all of this space here, which might have other stuff in it. So it can't just... yeah, it can't just do that. Can't just do rectangles. God damn it. Can't just do that. Unless there's some way to get out of this problem without having to use convex shapes. Or not convex yet, but more complicated shapes than rectangles. I mean, the obvious answer is to say, okay, you don't group them together, but that might, like, that's a limitation on what kinds of flows you can define, which is bad. I don't think of anything. I mean, in terms of... Nah. I'm not even sure if I already handle this stuff. I might have a system in place that already does this. Might. I say. Might. But let me try to refresh my memory on how things work right now and see if that already solves my problem. So the way things go right now is that you basically have a UI context, right? And the context has to receive all input events. So input goes here. And then the context has a pointer to a currently, sort of a pointer to an active element. And the active element gets all of the input events. So, some kind of... For example, if we're currently on a button, then the button would get all input elements. Now, let's say the user presses back, which means the focus should go a level upwards. Then the element looks up its parent and says, okay, here's the back event. Because it can't itself handle the back event, it delegates that to its parent. So any kind of event yeah. If it can handle it, yeah, do stuff. Nah. And to parent, right? So then the parent gets to deal with it. For instance, if we have a mouse move event, so the mouse goes somewhere else, and it is now outside of the buttons region, then the button says, okay, I can't deal with this, and it sends the event to its parent, if it has any. And then the parent says, okay, I'm gonna check if that's within my jurisdiction. And if so, then I'm going to send it to all of my subcomponents and see if any of those want it. And if not, then it goes one step up again. So every element basically first does... It tests whether the event is applicable, and that includes a region test. So that does not handle this problem, so that's not solved. Because in this case, for example, let's say that we're currently active on like this element here, right? And now the cursor is here. Means it's outside of this region. It says, okay, I can't deal with this. It sends it to its parent, which is this bar here, and that says, okay, I can't deal with this either, and that sends it to its parent, which is this big, like as big as the window, and that says, okay, that's within my region. I'm going to see if any of my children want that, and neither of those want it because it's outside of it, and then the event gets lost. So that problem persists. So how do we do this? One solution sort of for a container would be to eliminate this first kind of calling test, where it tries to minimize the number of tests it makes and simply ask each child whether they want to deal with it. Because in that case, it loses its sort of size and everything only becomes a test for the smallest possible element. But that can become potentially expensive, especially if you consider, for instance, a long list with potentially thousands of elements. Then that becomes infeasible to do. So we need to have some kind of call test that can quickly determine whether an event is applicable or not for a group. But the question is whether that's always necessary or always desirable. For instance, if you have a list, then it is very clear how to test, because you just test a rectangle, right? You test a visible area of the list. But in many other cases where you're simply composing things, it is not clear, and in that case you probably have no better choice than to simply say, okay, I'm going to ask each of my children whether they want to deal with it. So I guess that's how that has to work. I don't know. Oh no, Bagger's left. Oh, here he is again. Baggers, you do UI stuff. Help me out with this. I know you have a roast cooking and that's cool and all, but I don't know what I'm doing. What's happening? Well, right, so I don't know how much. The question is my current solution feasible? And okay, I guess I'll reiterate. The problem is of knowing when an event is concerns the current element or not. So I'll try to give this example again here. If you have this element which is currently active and you have a mouse click event there in this middle of the screen somewhere, then the element is going to say, no, that's not my deal. And it's going to send it to the parent, and the parent is this scroll, this sort of horizontal bar here, and it's going to say, no, that's not my deal either. And then it goes to the outer container for both of these bars, and that's going to say, nah, that's, well, that's going to say, yes, that's within my thing, while it isn't, because that group only covers these two sorts of areas. So now the problem becomes, how does it eliminate that false positive, I guess. And the way I'm currently proposing this is that only certain kinds of groups do region tests to eliminate having to ask the children about the region test. So for example, standard groups would simply ask each of the children immediately whether they want to deal with this event, and if not, then they'll send it back to the parent. But for instance, if you have a list, loads and loads of elements, the list is going to know, and it's going to have some kind of rectangular extent, so it can do a quick test first before asking any of the children whether they want to deal with it. So that sort of avoids or short circuits the query about whether the event is applicable or not. But in general, you can't do that because, yeah. The child takes up the middle, then the parent takes up that space too. Yeah, propagating makes sense. Okay. I don't know. I'll try to explain it again, just because I'm not sure if you understood properly. So what we have is we have two groups of things, right? Vertical and a horizontal bar. And these two groups are within another group. And because that group is a unification of both, it has a bounding box that encompasses both. But you might have other things in the middle here, right? So when an input event arrives, then this dark blue group here shouldn't take the event if it's somewhere here. But according to the bounding box, it should. So my proposal currently is that if the element is a group that simply contains other things and doesn't really have any logic of its own, then it should not do a bounding box test at all. Okay. Alright, I guess he's going to tend to his roast. Right. I don't suppose anyone else has an idea.
I'm still a bit lost on why this is an issue.
Well, the issue is that if you don't do tests, for example, if you have a list of lots and lots of elements, thousands of elements, then the list can't simply go and ask each of the 1,000 elements whether it wants to deal with an event or not. That would be too inefficient. That would slow things down way too much. That would make it lag like crazy if you move your mouse. So in some cases there needs to be a way to short-circuit the test whether an event is applicable or not. But in some cases there cannot be because the test would catch bad events. In this case, it will catch an event that doesn't concern it. In this fucking example here that I've been trying to illustrate. And what I'm sort of asking is if there's... what kinds of ways are there to deal with this kind of problem? Is there a way to not have to, like, encode in each kind of grouping whether it needs to do a test or not? Because it would be nice if the group could sort of automatically figure out how to do the testing. But I don't think that's really feasible.
So, whatever has those elements should know a union of its elements areas.
Yes. But again, the problem is that computing this union and testing for it is difficult and might even be more expensive than simply asking each child to deal with it and like test on its own, instead of trying to compute a union. and testing against the union. Like, the reason you want to do rectangle tests is because they're really cheap. And you can quickly eliminate things that fall outside of it. You dig?
Well, you could have a rectangle test on the parent that gets a "maybe this is relevant" result, and then ask the relevant elements within that area if they want to deal with things. Would that be faster?
Possibly, in some cases. Trying to think. I guess one of my confusions is that somewhere from somewhere the information has to come about whether the element deals with events itself or not. Because I don't know, maybe you might have a group that contains children, but also might in some cases deal with events itself directly. But in that case, is that really a case ever? Is that ever a case? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is a case, for instance, for the fan menu, because that needs to have a different kind of interaction scheme. But anyway, my point is that somewhere the information has to come. Well, from somewhere the information has to come about whether whether the region it covers is entirely its own or not. Because, you know, if you just have a button, then the entire rectangle covered by the button is its own, so it should have all the events that fall within it. But in this case, it's not the case. So, because this entire region down here is not part of the group, really. But for instance, if you have a list of things, right, then that's a group. It only contains children, has no real logic of its own, but it still covers the entire region, so you have both kinds of deals. So, I don't know. I guess that maybe this is relevant. This test could be... I'm not sure if that's better, because what I'm currently trying to think about is that possibly in most cases where you have a non-rectangular region to test, you're not covering a very small area anyway, so it would just incur another test that is kind of pointless, right? basically the reason you might want to do a containment test is so you can avoid having to test all the subregions in most cases. So if you have something that takes up very little screen real estate, so if you have a screen that's this big and then you have an element this big, and then you have another element this big, another one, and then these are in a group, right? Then you want to do the group test first so you can avoid having to do the 3 other tests. But if you have this case, then it's going to cover the entire screen anyway, so every kind of test is always going to succeed, so there's no point in doing a maybe. So, well, there's no point in testing for containment. So now the question becomes, is there a case where the area covered for small regions of the screen is going to have this problem? And I'm not sure if that's the case. Oh boy. Because if that is a thing, then it makes sense to do the maybe test. Otherwise, there's no point. I don't think doing a maybe test is necessary or beneficial, rather. But anyway, the conclusion I'm still coming to right now is that the group needs to know somehow whether it covers all applicable area or not. And based on that, it determines whether it needs to test its own area first and then the sub-elements, or whether it just immediately tests the sub-elements. Children. And an interesting question would be whether that's possible to determine automatically. And if so, if that's worth it. Let me put up some more GIFs. Nah. For GIFs. Nah. Not this. Nah. Let me see. Nah.
Happy New Year.
Thanks, though it hasn't happened yet. Oh. Let's put on there here. There we go. Right. Genji, are you clear on what the current state is now? Or are you still confused about something?
I'm clear. I just have no solution.
Okay. Alright. I mean, I think it would be possible to determine a coverage test, but I don't think it's worth it to do that. So each group would just have sort of a parameter that says, okay, I cover the entirety of all applicable area or not, and it would default to true. So then you would have to sort of pay attention that when you're doing a grouping like this, that you have to tick this to false. And I think that would solve that problem. Maybe. Oh, is the fucking Game of the Year awards out from Mega 64? That's good. Been waiting for that. Okay. So let me just let's reiterate what I've sort of gathered from this so far. Events propagate from parent to child. In Android, the collection should know enough about its children to know who to pass the event to. Follow the event if it decided its target. Yes, most UI toolkits do the thing where they have a parent and then it passes it on to the children. I don't. Explicitly, I don't. The reason I don't is because I need to not just handle mouse input or touch input, pointer input events. I also need to handle gamepad input events. So events that are simply next, previous, accept, or deny. And for that kind of flow, the scheme I'm proposing, which is inverted basically, is much more convenient and much faster, I would say even. So yeah, that's the reason why I'm inverting things. Alright, so to recap everything so far, in order to properly separate this kind of stuff, what I need to do is have some kind of method that is a containment test. So we have a, I guess, element, and then it has a contains test. And then we also have an, I guess, an applicable test. The contains test simply tests whether a point is within the area covered by the element. And then the element on its own can decide, okay, I have this kind of shape or this kind of shape, and depending on that, do the contains test. And then you have a sort of a method for applicable, which uses the contains test to determine whether an event concerns this element or not. And then the group can use the applicable test to check whether it should delegate the events to that kind of child. So group event check uses this shit. Right. And some of the group also has a sort of a cover property that says whether it can use its own extent information to do an early short circuiting discarding of events. Okay, and then of course each event element has a paint thingy that just does the drawing. I think that should cover it all. I think. This is just theory stuff. But I think that should cover it. Any questions? Or any remarks about things? Ideas for cases that could not be covered by this? Nothing? Okay. So that solves one of the issues, I believe. Can't really... trying to think of any other cases where the painting logic might influence the behavioral logic. I don't know. Hello, Invite. How are you doing tonight? Genji, are you still with me? Is the Italian TTS still bad? Let me see.
CQC.
Yes, it is. God damn it. Still terrible. I think Gingy died. Anyway, so I think that about covers that problem. Now, there was a different issue that I touched upon as well, which is that,
The Italian TTS has not kept up with its studies in CQC.
no, the bird sounds are not part of the song. Those are just my own birds being rowdy. Aren't ya? Yeah. Alright, so the other issue was... just, nah, oh, well, fucking whatever. The other issue was that, currently, the way things are done is... if this is your window, then the only way in which to position things is relatively. The idea being that if you resize stuff, then it should still be fine. Now, that's a neat idea in theory, but if you consider, let me make a smaller thingy. For instance, if we make a window that's like much wider, right? And then you have, let's say, some kind of, whoa, some kind of button thingy like this, right? Oh, calm the fuck on. Right. So the way you would declare this is by saying that, okay, here's a padding element and that has so much size, and this is another padding element, and this is another one. And these would have like, I don't know, 0.1, 0.1, and these would also have 0.1, so that's 4, and then this would have 0.6. So now if you make the window taller, then everything's just going to stretch. Similarly, you would have to specify sort of, you would have to put that into another layout where there's another padding stuff on both sides. Right, so you would have a 0.2 or something, I don't know, here, and then, you know. Now, that's cool in theory, but for instance, if we now resize this window and make it much taller than it is wide, right, then things are going to get ugly, because now you would have buttons that are like, yes, something like this. When you would probably rather have something like this. Hold on. Let me get this right. Or somewhat right, at least. Fucking. There we go. So, the issue is sort of that you want certain things to expand more than others, or like you want some things to be relative but not others. And that's a big problem. Or for instance, if you make it even if you shrink it down even more, like this window, and make it even wider relatively. You probably still want them to retain some size. Instead, the padding at the bottom to sort of take up the remaining space. But probably you would also want to have it in such a way that if you size up the entire thing to be much bigger, then you should all just scale appropriately. So it should scale linearly along with the rest of it, right? So you don't want this, you do want this, and you do want this, and you also do want this. So how does the layouting deal with this? This, you know, this sort of relative sizing computation is very appealing because it makes it trivial to do the layouting. All you need to do is add up the relative sizes, divide it by the or divide the height by it, and then allocate the sizes accordingly. So that's no problemo, but it doesn't really work for most things you want to do. At least I don't think it can work in a way you want it to work, at least. So now we need a better system. Something that ideally describes things succinctly and in a way that works as intended. Where's the video game? They told me there's video. Well, this is video game development, and in specific, I'm talking about problems related to the user interface in a game. So, you know, the buttons and menus and stuff. But there's no... I'm just brainstorming right now. There's no actual game at the moment. I'm going to be streaming some video games once we're done with this, which is gonna be in about 3/4 of an hour. I'll be streaming some more Splatoon. Just spoilers on that, I guess. Anyway, back to the plan. We need ideas for sizing information and size computation. One idea I've always kind of had is that, or you know, one solution to the problem of how does it know when you're just linearly scaling the entire thing up? For example, by switching from 720p to 1080p, and when does it know that you're just changing the format, for example, from widescreen to tall screen? I don't even know if there's a term for that. And the idea I've had is that you basically specify some kind of normal size. So you define a resolution that is intended to be the ideal for your window, and then if the current actual size is a multiple of that, you simply scale it. But if it is if the aspect ratio changes, then you compute the layout differently. But that only eliminates this case as a problem. It still doesn't solve, you know, these two cases. I'll label them. Hold on. Number 0, number 1. Number 2 and number 3. NJ, what are your thoughts? I know you've done UI stuff. Feel like I'm just talking to myself. Which I am, but you know.
My thoughts are that you are overcomplicating things.
Oh, really? Why would you say that? How would you do things so that they're not complicated? Or overcomplicated?
Either an UI is fixed in size and look, it scales vertically, or it scales horizontally. An element in the UI, I mean.
But if you change the screen size from 720 to 1080p, for instance, then the element has to scale in both vertical and horizontal to retain the look. Right? Well, the problem really is that the resolution doesn't even really give you any idea about screen real estate, right? Because it doesn't map to anything physical.
Why would it have to scale in both?
If you have the same monitor, but it might have, like, the same real size monitor might have both a 720p or 1080p resolution. So if you want things to be displayed the exact same, then it would have to scale in both. Right?
Then you to find that it scales according to the % of the resolution of the space it is within.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. But The problem is that that's not appropriate for a lot of cases. Like, that's literally what's happening right now. What happens right now is that each element defines a fraction of the vertical or horizontal space that it's going to take up. So a percentage of that. But the problem is that if you change the aspect ratio,
you define it to do that explicitly, not by default.
yeah, but how would you do layout computation if you don't have it relative? Like, I don't even know how your system would do anything at all.
I don't see why changing the aspect ratio is a problem though. It'd still stay around relative to everything else.
Okay. I don't know what kind of system you're imagining. I don't know how whatever you have in your head is supposed to work. What I'm saying is this. You want to have, as a user programmer, you want to have a system that, if you sort of design it with this here in mind. So for instance, this is your development setup screen. And then you lay out your things and you put them somewhere, however the hell that works, I don't even care. Right, and that's how it looks. And now, if you resize the window to be shorter, then the padding down here, for instance, should be consumed so that the size of the rest of the element stays consistent, because that's most likely what you want to happen, right? Or if you make it much taller, then it should expand to fit that. But for instance, if you scale the entire thing up, right, then the elements should all scale as well. So now the question becomes how, well, the question is, one, how do you specify this kind of information? And two, how does the system compute the effective pixel sizes for each element based on the information it has, which is the sizing information of each element and the current size of the window. What kind of game engine is this supposed to be anyway? This is for Trial, which is a general game, universal kind of game engine. It's not focused on anything in particular. What we're currently looking at is just user interfaces, which is sort of a separate topic on its own, really. It doesn't have much to do with game programming per se, unfortunately, but it is an important aspect of games, and so we need to have a solution for that.
So you define that the resolution is gained from the width of the UI space. Likely a default setting. Having a wider window causes things to zoom in this case. Then the individual elements are defined to be relative to each other starting from the top of the area.
Right. The thing is that, okay, so another problem is that if you, let me get rid of this. Ugh. For instance, if you make it extremely much wider for some reason, then at some point the buttons should stop growing probably, because otherwise things stretch too much. So that's another constraint that you probably want to have. Right? So basically what I can gather so far in terms of constraints that you as a user might want to have is how big is the component relative to some kind of default size, right? So what is its sort of base state? And then you want to define whether it can expand or contract, and if so, how much, right? Like what is its maximum minimum, and what is its tendency? Consume space. And this is all now starting to sound very similar to what other systems do. And it's also sounding very complicated and convoluted, which is what I was trying to avoid. Like here's a better example of why you want things to scale, but not always. So for instance, if you have a game, a HUD, for example, you have a radar down here, and then like, I don't know, health bar information up here. Right? So if the screen has a higher resolution, you probably want these to stay consistent relative to the actual real estate. So even if you have double the pixel density, you want those things to stay consistently big. They should take up the same amount of screen real estate. But if the screen only gets wider or only gets taller, then they shouldn't get stretched in that area, because then it would like look like fucking this, right? And that's not what you want. In that case, you still would want it to be like you know, appropriately sized, appropriately placed, but not stretched weirdly. So that's big. Generally, what I want is some kind of system that is much simpler than most conventional
So the HUD
stuff.
elements are positioned relatively, but size is fixed. Pretty common for a game UI.
Well, again, the size is not fixed, because it needs to scale proportionally. If the screen changes proportionally. Hollow Knight, I've only heard good things about, so you probably check it out. Could make a platform at some point. I did make a shoot man game at one point, like an arena shooter kind of dealio on earlier episodes. I am itching to get to making another game, but I really want to get this done first, or at least make some progress on it. I'm just very busy recently, so there's not too much I can do. Okay, so let's go back to this example here. When you change the screen to this, there's two ways in which to resolve this problem. One of them is to preserve the width, in which case this one gets much smaller, and so there's this. Or it's to preserve the height, in which case to get much bigger. Alright. So how does the system know what the hell to do? Ori was great. Yeah, Ori was pretty good. Except for the escape sequences. I fucking hated those. I rage quitted on like the last one. Oh man, have you watched some speedruns of Ori? Some good stuff out there. They have a pretty active community. Why? I wonder if you could do things by having each element define a sort of a resting size and then a springiness, which is a single number, well, a number for horizontal and vertical, saying how easily it can be deformed. And then have sort of a, well, basically sort of something like a spring resolving, where you do the farther it stretches, the harder it gets to stretch it anymore, depending on the
That
spring.
actually sounds really good.
Yeah. So for instance, for things that should say aspect same, then you would have the same spring factor in both sizes, right? No, that doesn't make any sense. Never mind. Or then you would have the spring How would you deal with that? How would you deal with this case? You would have to have something here that is very easy to spring, to deform, and here's something that is very easy to deform as well. And the resting size would be defined how relative to base resolution. I always come back to that. I always come back to the necessary base resolution definition. Because otherwise there's no way to determine whether it needs to scale or not. So basically in this case you would have this and this very springy, I don't know, I guess, and this will be not low, and then it, because this is high springy, then it would easily expand or contract, whereas the other one would refuse to change its size. Is it that hard to make some scalable menu UI? I mean, I played tons of games with various screen resolutions and the menus seem good. Yeah. I don't know what current systems do, really. I know how, like, typical, like how web applications do it and how desktop applications do it, but I don't know how games do it. Because for like desktop applications, you usually don't need to worry about different kinds of resolutions. You just need to worry about resizing the window. So that's much easier to deal with. But for games, you often have the case that you might need to deploy your game on many different resolutions and different kinds of aspect ratios, so it becomes a bit of a problem. And yeah. Like the way Android, for instance, does it, like mobile devices all have similar kinds of constraints, because you have different kinds of mobile devices that have different resolutions and sizes and stuff. The way Android does it is you either specify your sizes in display points, which is like I think something that is relative to the device display resolution or something. And then you have something that says like match parent, where it tries to be as big as possible. And then you have like wrap content, which tries to be as small as possible, sort of. And then you have sort of ways in which to attach the element to another one and then define paddings between that. So that's how that's done. But what I'm wondering is whether there's a simpler way to do it all. Like what I'm brainstorming for here is something that is a system that works for all kinds of problems and isn't too hard to sort of get going with. Because most UI systems for desktop applications are really complex. Like that's what I mentioned before. For instance, what you often have is like each element defines a minimum size, a maximum size, a preferred size, and an expansion policy that describes whether it wants to take up more space or less space depending on what's available. And like trying to figure out in your mind what that actually means in practice is really difficult. Yeah, I should probably research some. That's one of my general kinds of problems, is that I don't research much. I usually just think of stuff by myself and then try things out instead of looking what other people have done. I enjoy the act of figuring out a solution to a problem too much, and I'm too lazy to read other people's stuff. I guess that's the reason why. So back to this proposition of having a sort of a spring factor. So in this case, you would have this spanning element would have a very high spring factor.
That's a pretty common problem.
I don't reinvent the wheel, so to say. I try to find a different wheel to build, really. Well, it is still reinventing the wheel, yes, but oftentimes there's a good reason to do it, because just doing what other people have already done doesn't really progress anything, then you're just copying things. But, you know, re-examining the problem, looking at it from different angles and imagining things, how they could go, is, can lead to progress. New frontiers and stuff. Anyway, so in this case, you would define this bottom stuff to be very springy, in which case it would expand or contract in order to fill or give way to the necessary space. And in this case, like to cover the widening, you would say that like sort of the menu buttons are sort of a bit springy in the width department, so that they can expand to some extent. But then you will make the paddings on the side much more springy, so that they more easily consume space. Basically what that means, what the spring factor means, is that you're relating the size of the UI element not linearly to the available space, but exponentially, right? Since the spring force computation is an exponential formula, isn't it? If I recall correctly. What is the spring force thing? R squared times spring factor or something? Something. I don't remember fucking high school physics. I should, but I don't. Anyway, that's an interesting idea that is worth following up on if I can figure out how the layouting mechanism would actually use this spring information to compute the effective sizes. Probably have to solve a PDE. Probably. Or rather an NLSE, nonlinear system of equations. Yeah, so just thinking about it right now, I can't really determine whether that's the solution or not. So I'll just have to sit down one day and try to implement such a system to see how far I can get. Oi! Stop that. Alright, yeah. At least we solved one issue out of two. And the other one partially, I guess. Or potentially. Yeah. Any other kinds of remarks or ideas or things? Nah, my bird isn't trying to explain anything to you. He's just mad at the fucking... Like, they have, like, poison there that they can, do stunts on, or I guess, and he's mad that it's swinging around too much. That's it. Not really complicated problems. I wish I could pet my birds, dude. They're not tamed, though, so... They're too scared. Right. So I can implement this system to resolve the painting problem easy enough. That doesn't take much. We're pretty much there already. So this problem is easy to solve. This one will require more thought and consideration and implementation. So, no idea when I'll get done with that. Starting tomorrow, I'm gonna have to start studying for exams. Yeah. Exams are end of January, beginning of February, so I won't have too much time for things other than studying. Or at least, right now, I'm not allocating any time for anything other than studying. I will still do the Treehouse on Sundays, so don't worry about that. Next week is still gonna happen. I'm not sure yet what we'll do. Maybe we'll start making a game after all. Who knows? But yeah, probably won't get any work done on trial on my own.
Speaking of birds, folks at the Uni of Washington are working on to figure out what crows are talking about when dusk comes. They have this location where thousands of crows come spend the night and figured out a way to set up their microphones so that they can tell the voice of an individual bird from a distance.
Neat. Crows are cool. So I'm all for any kind of research on those buggers. Crows are also smart, but I'm pretty sure my birds are fucking stupid. Like, the things they do sometimes can't be explained in any other way. But that's okay, I love them anyway. Right. Yeah, so Treehouse is still gonna happen, TGIF is still going to happen, but streams other than that, other than on Friday and Sunday, are not confirmed, so don't hold your breath for that kind of stuff. Might still happen occasionally, depending on how I feel about it, but mostly, yeah, no more constant evening streams. Just Fridays and Sundays. Yeah, I don't really know what else I could talk about. Or
I will hold my breath for Wednesday art streams.
nah, dude, don't do that. Besides, Wednesday evenings are reserved for baggers streams. Or whenever he starts doing that again. Anyway, yeah, I don't really have anything to show since I haven't worked on trial in the interim. And other than what's on here, I don't really know what else to talk about anymore. So I think we're done for this treehouse. Yeah. Done and done. Alright. Yeah, see you guys next treehouse. Yes.